what just get your take on Steve. I'll start with you, and Tori, feel free to chime in. I mean, what is behind the inflation that we're seeing now? Everybody thought it was going to be transitory or not a big deal, or worked through by now, but it just keeps rising.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their favorite excuse. I mean, everybody points to COVID and the supply chain effects that have, reduced shipping, unloading the freight containers at all of the harbors. And, you've got, the war in Ukraine that's affected food and oil prices. You've got the Biden and previous to that, the Trump stimulus proposals. So, there's a combination of factors that I think all of them have contributed to some degree. I've not yet seen any careful studies that attempt to tease out, how much is attributable to each of those factors. But, I'm a little old school here. And, at the end of the day, I believe that inflation is largely, perhaps not as Milton Friedman said, always and everywhere, but I think most of the time and largely it's a monetary phenomenon. And, the Fed lowered interest rates and held them at zero for an inordinate amount of time. And they were just beginning to raise interest rates, from zero upward. And the COVID pandemic hit. And so they lowered them back to zero again. And when you keep interest rates so low for so long, financial markets basically turn that into deposits and loans and credit. And when there's too much money chasing the available goods, and then of course, when you have supply factors like COVID and the war, you have fewer goods. And, the Fed waited too long to hit the brakes on monetary policy. They should have been raising rates and stopping their bond purchases last fall. And, they assumed incorrectly that the COVID pandemic was going to be, more like the financial crisis in terms of its effect on the economy. And it just simply wasn't. And so they overestimated the need for monetary stimulus. And so as a result, we've got to see that unwound, and they're just now getting started. And I think they've got a long way to go.
I want to get back to the Fed, but Tori, before we do that, switch back to the real world of politics and what's facing the Biden administration. Keeping in mind everything Steve said, the administration has to be responsive, but is there really anything that they can do?
Well, that's the conundrum, right? Is that they've got a midterm election coming up, and they've got obviously a presidential election coming in 2 years. Democrats hold functioning majorities in the House, the Senate, and obviously they control the White House. So there really is, the possession arrow is with the Democrats. They have the ball. What are they going to do with it? And there really isn't a lot. When your inflation problem is a monetary phenomenon or it's a supply shock phenomenon, there really isn't a lot that the federal government can do, because they're largely a demand side, policy. Fiscal policy usually affects demand. So, I know that they're casting about for ideas. There's been a lot of conversation, for example, about a temporary federal gas tax holiday, which would, federal gas tax is somewhere around 18 cents per gallon. If they temporarily suspend that gas tax, that might make gasoline at the pump a little bit cheaper, but when gas is $5.50, $6 a gallon, 18 cents per gallon, isn't really going to make a big, huge dent in the price of gasoline. So I think the Biden administration, they've talked about things like lowering the price of prescription drugs, but that requires some legislation. They've talked about gas tax holiday. Again, that would require legislation from Congress, which of course, in order to get legislation through the Senate, you need 10 Republicans to sign on with all of the Democrats in the Senate to say, yes, we want to do that. That makes it difficult. The Biden administration, they've released millions of barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to try and reduce energy prices. But when you look at inflation, the big four components that are driving inflation at the current moment, it's energy, food, cars, and housing. And there isn't on the energy front, oil prices are determined internationally. It's a global market for oil and gasoline. So that's not something that the US really has a lot of control over. Cars, that's a function of inputs to production. And so that's affected by COVID and the chip shortage and things like that. The federal government can't do anything about, right now. Maybe they can provide, tax incentives to build more chip plants in the United States, but it takes several years, if not a decade, to get those plants online and operating. So the Biden administration is really behind the curve in that, they're beholden for this predicament, but they don't have many tools